farmers are growing enough food, so why do we keep hearing about food shortages? This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. Consumer habits changed almost overnight, with many being ordered by their state leaders to stay at home. As restaurants, schools, and other institutions closed, many farmers have had nowhere to send their products. Some dairies dumped milk, and some farmers plowed under vegetable crops unharvested. At the same time, milk can be sparse at the supermarket, and now President Trump is ordering meat processing plants to stay open. Joining us from Chicago to talk about what's happening with the meat industry and other issues with the food supply and the supply chain is Jacob Bunge. He's a reporter and covers agriculture for the Wall Street Journal. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for joining us. First of all, can we start with President Trump and his executive order? Why did he do this, and what does this executive order allow him to do?
The order that the president implemented invokes a Korean War-era law that lets the federal government direct production of different sorts of goods if it's a matter of national security. And President Trump's administration has invoked this in the past month, for instance, in the sense of supplies of ventilators and other medical products. Here, though, it's a totally different situation. They're invoking this act to basically make sure that meatpacking plants can continue to operate without the concern that a state or a local government could force them to shut down.
And why? Why are we seeing this concern for shutdown at plants? We've obviously heard that some of these meat processing plants, they've had high numbers of workers that have come down with coronavirus.
You're right. An awful lot of them have become hot spots for COVID-19 infections. There are hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who work in these plants, hours at a time. They're standing next to each other. They're moving around the plants. As a result, there's been caution and sometimes direct calls from governors, mayors, even a sheriff in Iowa, really putting pressure on these meatpacking companies to close down the plants, to try and help get it under control in some way.
The sheriff, not mentioning Tyson specifically, did place some blame on one particular plant in the county.
Many of these cases are attributable to just one local employer. And having visited that location and witnessed their attempts and approaches to employee protection and safety practices as it pertains to the COVID-19 virus, there was clearly more that could and should have been done. Today, our entire countywide healthcare delivery and virus response system is paying the price for those lapses in protocol.
And so the President's Act is trying to provide some sort of buffer here. The plants can continue to operate under the say-so of the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, that's Sonny Perdue, and potentially provide some sort of leeway for the plants to keep going and keep producing meat and head off any further shortfalls in meat production.
We've heard about some plants around the country that have closed temporarily, and at those plants they've tried to clean up and create some level of social distancing with maybe some plastic barriers between workers and other kinds of protections. Have those plants, when they've come back online, proven to be safer, less likely to create infection among workers?
Well, we're only starting to see the answer to that question in the last week or so. The first plants that closed down were some beef plants in the state of Pennsylvania.
Meatpacking plant in Hazleton is closed tonight after 164 workers came down with coronavirus. WFMZ.
Just over the past week, those have come back online. So far, at least in Pennsylvania, the indications have been good. 80 to 90% of the workers are returning. And so far, there's not been a significant spike in infection rates in those places. And the CDC has put in place guidelines for these plants to follow as far as things like requiring masks on the employees and where possible spacing employees out. But there's a couple of potential hurdles to all of this. One is that the CDC guidelines are not required. It's up to the USDA to decide if the companies are following these to the best of their ability. The other issue is the simple fact that these meatpacking plants are not set up for social distancing. They're designed for people to work side by side. In some ways, there's a real limit to how much social distancing can be done in a meat plant and still operated in the normal way.
How bad have infections been among workers at some of these meat processing plants? And sort of what has that meant in some of the communities where these are the really large employers for the people of these towns and smaller areas?
Well, the places where the meatpacking plants are located, the infection rates are quite high. For example, in southwestern Minnesota, a city named Worthington, where JBS, one of the big meatpacking companies, runs a pork plant, the local officials there had estimated the county's rate of infections, now this being the sort of number of infections compared with the number of people in the county, it was on par with New York City.
If Minnesota's pandemic has an epicenter, you'll find it in Nobles County, where mass testing shows a per capita infection rate of 4%.
We've seen a definite change here in Worthington, especially over the last week and a half.
City Council
now,
member
the companies and USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue have argued that you can't necessarily tie the infection rates directly to the plants, and that oftentimes the workers will live in housing complexes and apartment buildings and where there might be a lot of people living in close quarters as well, and that's a contributing factor that people need to take into account. So they're arguing basically that the meatpacking plants shouldn't shoulder all of the blame for these higher rates of infections. But the fact remains that the places where these plants are seeing an awful lot of people getting sick with this.
People are terrified, absolutely terrified.
Father Jim Callahan at St. Mary's Catholic Church says the fear's palpable. His parish serves the faith, food, and medical needs of many of the plant's immigrant workers.
Not only have their incomes definitely gone down, and some have just stopped altogether. They're making choices. Do I buy my medication or put food on the table or pay my rent?
While the plant and union look for ways to reopen safely, Father Callahan says parishioners will continue caring for the most vulnerable as needs and numbers continue to grow. Bill Hudson, WCCO 4 News.
Over the past week or so, the president of Tyson Foods, one of the big processors, has come out and said, look, our meat supply is going to be in some real trouble here. And now, did President Trump's order, was that a direct response to that information?
Well, I'd be speculating on that. It's safe to say that the Trump administration was watching all this very closely. There were concerns within the Trump administration that the percentage of U.S. meat production would decline even further than it already had if plants continued to close. And so their concern was figuring out a way to make sure that these meat packing plants continue to operate and that grocery store meat cases don't go empty. And we already have seen some instances where the selection of meat products is narrowed. There's fewer choices just because the meat packing plants are trying to prioritize the things that they can make with the least amount of people. In some cases, we've talked to grocery stores where they're not getting all of their meat orders filled because the suppliers don't have enough. And people in the industry expect that's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Right. So this is where President Trump has stepped in. What does his order actually say? It's been reported as if he's saying meat processing plants are required to stay open. Is that accurate?
Well, I look at it more like the federal government is the one that has the authority over when these meatpacking plants have to close. It effectively means that a state and a county health department cannot force one of these plants to close unless the USDA agrees. It's a way or a buffer for the meatpacking plants to continue to function, but they're still reliant on their workers coming in. The president can't compel workers to show up every day. They don't really contemplate that as part of this executive order. It's partly up to the meat companies and to the folks at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to make sure that the plants are safe enough that the workers want to come back.
50 workers walked off the job at the Purdue plant in Kathleen. The employees who walked out told 13 WMAZ's Sarah Hammond they don't feel safe working at the plant during the coronavirus pandemic, and they want the plant to do more to protect its workers.
They're risking our life for a chicken. All we're asking now is just to sanitize the building. Everybody that's been exposed to it, they need to go home. These folks are still on the floor.
The people who we feel like they love, they getting them to work from home.
Yeah.
But they got us in here working.
The order does seem to be pitting the big meat companies against their own workers. We've heard a lot from unions that are concerned for their workers, that are, and there's been some reporting with quotes from workers themselves saying that when they didn't feel well and tried to report in that they weren't coming to work that day, they were told that they were fired. And now meat processing companies are starting to backtrack on that and kind of tell those people, we're changing policy. What do you see as happening between meat companies and their workers at this point?
Well, the meat companies have tried to sort of get ahead of this in some ways. Over the month of March, a lot of them were announcing temporary pay increases, for example, as an incentive for workers to keep on coming in. They were offering, in some cases, for the first time, to pay workers for staying home sick and giving time off if people had to take care of children or loved ones, for example. They're trying to do what they can to check temperatures, for example. They're also taking any number of measures inside the plants themselves. But you still have a situation where an awful lot of these workers are afraid for their own health, and they're afraid of getting the virus at work and passing it to an elderly loved one that might have a pre-existing condition or be otherwise at risk like that. And so at the end of the day, it's still going to be a question of whether or not these workers feel comfortable coming in to continue to work every day.
Yeah, and at least one union we spoke with said the president's order should have started with the mandatory actions to protect workers and consumers, and instead of focusing on the need to keep plants open and providing these voluntary guidelines for things like social distancing and other worker protections you've been talking about. It's an interesting dynamic with now the federal government saying we're going to be the ones to decide if these plants are safe enough to stay open. What are you hearing from the states and the locals about that? Do they trust that the USDA will make the right decisions, has the manpower to take care of this kind of situation?
At the local level, there's still a lot of concern about this.
When the JBS pork plant in Worthington resumes some operations on Wednesday, Mayor Mike Cooley says the entire community will be holding its breath.
I'm concerned, I'm anxious, I hope that all the precautions have been put in place at the plant.
The plant where nearly 500 workers tested positive for COVID-19.
These plants are sometimes the biggest employer in these towns. It's a real worry among some of these folks like the local mayors that if they reopen the plants too soon, that there'll be another surge in infection rates.
We think it's as safe as possible. They think it's as safe as possible. But we won't know until we actually get into the process.
And some of these towns do not have strong local health systems. I talked to the mayor of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I mean, he recognize that at this point, maybe it makes sense for the federal government to step in because the food system is bigger than any one municipality, even a city as large as Sioux Falls. They're going to watch and see what happens, and I don't think that they're going to stop talking about it, even if they don't necessarily have the authority to close down any of these facilities.
What has been the impact on farmers that produce pork and chicken and beef?
That's been one of the more gruesome aspects of this whole thing. Having these slaughterhouses closed down is a major problem for the farmers that need to send poultry or livestock to them to be processed and, for that matter, to get paid for it. With the chicken plants being slower, we've seen only a couple of cases where those plants have closed down, but it's a bit easier to manage, partly because chickens can grow to their market weight in just a few weeks, and the chicken companies control the supply of birds that go onto the farms, and so they're able to take the eggs out of incubators rather than hatch them. The cattle ranchers have a little bit more flexibility in the sense that they can keep their cattle out on pastures longer. They don't necessarily run out of space for them. They can keep them on feedlots, or for the dairy cattle, the dairy cows that are being milked that often will go to slaughterhouses, they can continue milking those. But it's the pig farmers that are the ones that are in the most trouble, because they operate on a system that's much like a pipeline, where they'll raise the hogs from piglets on up to about 290 pounds, and then they need to be sent to the slaughterhouse. And oftentimes they'll have another delivery of young pigs coming up in just a matter of weeks. And so they need the space in the barns to put those in. They need the time to clean out the barns before they bring the new ones in. And when they're not able to make deliveries to the slaughterhouses, as they're not now in parts of the upper Midwest, it creates a real problem because the hogs continue to gain weight. They start to crowd the barns. It's unsafe for the pigs. And in the meantime, the farmers need to continue to care for them and continue to feed them. So you're seeing situations now where the hog farmers are trying to look around for feed that will basically be like a salad for the hogs, where they'll eat it but not gain a lot of weight. And they can try to prevent overcrowding. But some of these farmers are getting to the point now where they're having to look at euthanasia for thousands and thousands of hogs.
These pigs, they don't have anywhere to go. So today I spent some time with Trish and Aaron Cook. They've been running this farm for 25 years, and they tell me that they are facing some bleak options when it comes to the fate of these pigs. Take a listen.
Well, in the short term, we'll try and do the best we can. We'll maybe feed them a less dense diet and try to slow them up a little if possible, but you know, that only buys you a little bit of time. That can buy us a week or two, but you know, ultimately they're going to have to come out. And so that means we're hoping to avoid euthanizing them, but it's definitely one of our biggest fears at this point.
There was a plant that started back up in southern Minnesota this week. This is one of the plants that had been closed due to infections among workers, and they brought back in a skeleton crew of about 10 or 20 people just to run the kill line. And they're slaughtering about 3,000 hogs a day and effectively looking to either render the carcasses or bury them somewhere. It's just an awful situation for a farmer.
Harry Sloot had more than 1,000 hogs ready to be processed, but coronavirus closures at pork plants and restaurants have left hundreds of pigs sitting on his farm.
We don't want to have to do the unthinkable, which would be euthanize these hogs because there's nowhere to go with them.
Every pig that a hog farmer raises is going to go to a slaughterhouse eventually, but that's for the purpose of producing food for people. And it's a much different thing when a farmer's got to look at a barn full of animals that he's put months into raising, trying to keep healthy and hopefully provide food at the end of the day, and instead look at the prospect that those animals are going to have to be killed and wasted.
These pigs should have been marketed 2 weeks ago. This barn should have been empty.
But the barn isn't empty because right now these 1,200 or so pigs have nowhere to go.
We went from having planned all of this 10 months out, having a market for these pigs, that flipped on a switch.
Brad Kluver is a third-generation pig farmer in Northfield.
It's really been a struggle, and we're trying to kind of hold it together.
It's what I've grown up loving doing. Right now, right now it's on the line.
Jacob Bunge is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Julie Grant.